Hi all. There's a very interesting past encounter between Vishy Anand and Magnus Carlsen, who are playing a World Championship match just in a few days' time now. The excitement's building up, so I thought I'd add a bit of completeness to my playlist for previous encounters, and I hope you check it out. This was a rapid format, so that's typically, the games are around 30 minutes, but usually they have increments as well. So each move you get a little bit of extra time. The FIDE ratings of both players, Vishy was 28.17 and Magnus 28.15, and I think these ratings were not the FIDE rapid ones, but just normal standard time control ones being used for this. So e4 from Vishy Anand. And what interests me about this game is the kind of King's Engine style that Black adopts later on. So let's see how this happened. e5, knight f3, knight c6, Roy Lopez, bishop e5. And a very solid move now, knight f6 from Magnus. Queen e2, a bit of a surprise move. Now queen e2 is played. The most usual, of course, is just castling. Less used is knight c3. There's also d3, but queen e2, a bit of a surprise move from Vishy Anand. We see now a6, bishop a4, bishop e7. And White's still interested in constructing a centre, so c3, and the bishop can also be tucked into on c2 if needed. d6, White castles, Black castles, d4. So it looks fairly pleasant for White so far. Let's add a bit here, just to see the evaluation is slightly okay for White. It's a slight advantage exists apparently. So bishop d7, and now we see a move which does change the nature of the position drastically, where pawn chains, undermining pawn chains or gaining space on both sides of the board are more effective plans, because we see this move d5. So this locked in pawn chains is reminiscent of a King's Engine defense. We see knight b8. That knight doesn't matter if it's undeveloping here, because it's much more closed now, the style of the position. Tactics need to be brewed up first with pawn chain undermining. White's usually going to play for c4, c5 in this structure. This bishop is useful on e7 here, adding support against such a structural intention. We see actually White's taking the bishop on d7, and this is usually a good thing for a King's Engine defense kind of strategy for White, because it means later, even if Black later plays for f5 and f4, without the light square bishop, White can usually construct a defense with h3 without having sacrifices of the bishop, etc. It's less dangerous usually for White's king safety to get rid of the light square bishops. Also, these pawns on the light squares means Black is already weaker on the light squares. So knight b takes d7, c4. So this familiar King's Engine pawn structure is now evident. But as I say, this bishop on e7 and the knight, they're ideally posted for c5 to discourage c5. Black really wants to get on with f5 potentially, and Magnus plays g6. Very, very cute maneuver now for g6 to support f5 without White being able to necessarily take without a pawn recapturing, because that would often give White the e4 square. So we see this cute maneuver, knight h5, with the idea now of fianchetting the knight to be able to play f5, and on any e takes, we just takes, and we get the g file pressure. So rook b1, knight g7, and White's carrying on with this plan, which is very reminiscent of a King's Engine defense now. Just the bishop is kind of being remaneuvered here. It looks kind of ideal in many respects for Black, because that c5 doesn't look too dangerous here. f5 though, I mean the bite's been taken out of f5 because Black hasn't got the light square bishop, but even so, let's see. Vishy now played bishop e3. Engines don't really evaluate sometimes closed positions that well, but there's an intriguing idea that was mentioned here, bishop h6. Tactically, it's actually difficult to evict the bishop, and if that is the case, actually the h pawn is restricted, so it might actually give White more time for c5. This is definitely something to investigate in this position. that could it actually be useful to throw in bishop h6 and carry on the queen side. But anyway, that's just a theoretical observation. We see bishop e3, which seems to actually invite tempo gaining with f4 and for black to carry on in King's Indian style. What is actually white threatening with bishop e3? Well, maybe, you know, c5, even as a pawn sack, might be on the cards here, just to sort of get pressure on b7 if ever taking. We see actually rook b8. So black is at the moment prepared for c5. If he had played f4, that's a basic question here. What does white actually do here? Maybe just dropping the bishop back is okay. Maybe it doesn't it doesn't matter about the tempo. It would seem ordinarily you don't want to do this. Isn't black going to stampede with g5? But h3, without the light square bishop, h3 is actually, there's actually quite a lockdown on the squares here. If something like h5, then knight h2. Okay, but something similar actually happened in the game anyway. We see Magnus throwing in, though, in this position. Actually, he didn't play f4. He actually threw in rook b8. And now we see rook fd1. And now queen e8. So f4 seems to be useful. And after a4, it's finally played f4. Has white been overly provocative? Isn't this a speed of undermining pawn chains on both sides of the board? Bishop drops back to d2. g5. And white tries to restrain g4, h3, h5. Knight h2, and now queen g6. So pressure is now being built around to play g4 here. f3 trying to batten down the hatches. Knight e8 now. What does knight e8 do? Well, potentially king g7 now and rook at h8. So some manoeuvring going on to make g4 as effective as possible. Rook dc1, as though there might be an intention at some point of c5. Knight e f6. So the knight, from Magnus' perspective, is better on f6 than it was on g7. King f1, is the king making a run for it? King f7. King e1, yes it is. It's fleeing to the queen side. But we're left then with still this strategic break. Is it of any value? Well, it could be. Even if it got a rook to the 7th rank, that would be dangerous. And in fact, Magnus pursues that idea with g4. If white tries to win a pawn here, I don't think this is very healthy at all. hg, if fg, and just rook h8, and we start feeling the pressure as white here. This is actually very, very bad for white indeed, because we've got loads of pressure now on g2 after. That's a backward pawn then after that. So white wants to keep his structure intact. So after this g4, just plays king d1. And now Magnus plays g takes h3, g takes, and rook g8. So he's dominating that g file. White really hasn't arranged any dangerous ideas with c5. King c2, and now queen g2, infiltration on the 7th rank. With an immediate idea of maybe just taking and then rook g2 to win a piece, to try and win a piece. Because the knights would be forked if this knight has to come back. And this rook is forking them. So we see rook h1 and advance to that, but Magnus takes on e2 anyway. He's content to get a rook on the 7th rank. The undermining operation has yielded a significant amount of pressure now, and you might think, well, what is the concrete threat? Well, this knight has to be protected, king d3. But now we see a bit of overloading with knight b6, because knight b6 forks both of these pawns, so threatening knight takes a4, and maybe knight takes c4 as well, because the king is a bit overloaded protecting there. We see now Vishy playing rook bg1. I don't think there's anything he could have actually, he couldn't actually do much about this position. This is already a very, very passive position indeed after knight b6. What does white actually do? So he's losing a pawn basically, because a little interruption reinforcing the rook leaves the same scenario now. That black is threatening knight takes a4 and knight takes c4, two principal threats. So this infiltration on the king side with this knight b6 seems to be wonderfully effective. The king is overloaded. We see a5 just letting the c pawn go. It's not very healthy. So if king takes, now rook takes e2, and that's pretty nasty. Let's have a quick peek at that position. It looks pretty nasty, this position. Even if the rook has to go back, white's later now he can play c6 and break this chain, explode this chain. It's a common pattern for King's Indian players. Generate some pass pawns in the centre. Not very nice at all. So we'll go back. So in this position, bishop c1. And now the knight's reinforced with b5, which Indians actually really like this position, just reinforcing that nuisance knight. A takes. And now actually there was a little bit of a tactical opportunity if c takes, which wasn't played, but this did create an idea of knight takes f4. So if e takes, then we can take on c4, and white's nearly okay there. But Magnus just played knight takes b6, so that was actually the threat as well. So b5, if we look at this position for b5, white is actually threatening knight takes f4, so he's got the bishop out of the way for this king takes c4 to be a concrete threat when he moved the bishop. Okay, so b5, a takes, knight takes, so clear pawn up. Is it enough? Knight f1, and now we see knight h7, and it looks as though this bishop's going to be very useful on h4. If the bishop can get to h4, you can get to f2 and reroute on this diagonal. That'd be a very useful diagonal. h4 stops that now, but it's a target. Knight f8, just manoeuvring to g6 to make that a second target, another pawn to pick up soon. Bishop e1, knight a4 now is played. Again, a kind of overload, tickling the king potentially with knight b2. The king's got to stand to protect e2 here. So what can actually white do in this position against knight b2? Some moves will undoubtedly lose very quickly. If we look at, say, knight c1, check, for example, and here knight d1 check, knight f2 is increasing black's advantage. Black's now just taking on h4, and there's not much compensation next. After knight d2, we just take on h4. So it's pretty miserable position already after knight a4. This tickling with knight b2 is very effective. We see rook g1 just consigned to losing another pawn. Magnus just takes that rook and now takes on h4. So 2 pawns up. Vishy plays bishop d2, king e7, knight h3. Now king d7. It looks as though the idea of blowing up the pawn chain has reared its head again. Bishop stands watch of g5. There's no entry points for white. Both knights seem passive. This pawn's stopping any knight infiltration like that. So white's in big trouble here, and Vishy actually resigned in this position. But what is the actual concrete threats? Let's have a look. Is it really c6? Let's give white a move like bishop c1. In this position, maybe c6 is not even needed, but it's a good move. But maybe even knight e7, just preparing it, is better. And now c6, and this pawn chain is very favourable. It's 2 pawns up still, and once we get in like things like this, it starts to be very unpleasant. Also, this pawn is now under fire as well. So basically, 2 pawns down. Vishy had resigned. I think after knight h3 or thereabouts. So I hope you enjoyed that encounter. It was just showing remarkable positional understanding from Magnus Carlsen, even in King's Indian style positions, which we normally don't see Magnus in. But it just happened to resemble the King's Indian pawn structure with the same sort of plans. But even though the white king evacuated, black was left with major pressure with that rook on the 7th, and then the overloading of the white king to nab a pawn, and then another pawn dropped to stop an infiltration of the bishop. It all started falling to pieces. It shows Magnus's ability on rapid chess is extraordinary, as well as Vishy, but both players are extraordinarily strong on rapid and blitz chess. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.